Today, we bring you a very special program with faith leaders from different faiths addressing the critical issues of racial justice and equity. Our weekly program brings the expertise and perspective of Virginia's legislators, faith leaders, policy experts, and community activists. We focus on economic, racial, social, and environmental justice. The broadcast also shares resources and opportunities for you to get involved in our work advancing social justice and helping our neighbors. The program keeps you up to date and keeps our elected officials accountable. Also, this is an interactive broadcast. We encourage you to please ask questions by writing them in on Facebook during the show. Our guests today are faith leaders on the front lines of the fight for racial justice. Dr. Corey D.B. Walker is professor at Wake Forest University. He is also an ordained American Baptist minister. Hurunnessa Fariad is head of outreach and interfaith for the Adams Center, which is the all Dulles area Muslim society in Sterling, Virginia. It is also the second largest mosque in the nation and the largest in Virginia. The Right Reverend Jennifer Brooke-Davidson, who is Assistant Bishop for the Episcopal Diocese of Virginia, and Rabbi Michael Knopf of Temple Beth El in Richmond. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, my colleague and friend, Reverend Dr. Faith Harris, who is Interim Co-Director of Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. Faith is also Assistant Professor of Theology at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology and Director of the Center for Faith, Leadership, and Public Life at Virginia Union University. Welcome, and thank you, Faith.
Thank you, Roberta. Good morning, everyone. I want to open our conversation with a brief quote from Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail speech or writing. And it's probably, I think, the most significant of his writings. And so it reads this. I read this. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. And so with that quote as our backdrop, I want to go to our first question, and I would ask everyone on the panel to respond to this question. How does your faith tradition define justice for itself and for others? And then a follow-up, in other words, how is justice defined within the sacred text, the dominant narratives, or the practice of your faith? Who would like to go first?
Well, I'll be glad to rush in. Probably the largest question before us and a complex one, but I'll try to be somewhat brief about it. In the Christian tradition, the idea of justice, of course, goes back to one of the very early texts that all of us on this call share, the book of Genesis, with the idea that all human beings are made in the image of God. All human beings made in the image of God. And then that idea develops throughout our tradition as we articulate more and more clearly the notion that God is, in fact, love. That is stated in that sentence very late in the New Testament, but is part of what goes on all through our common scriptures. Justice, as we understand it, develops mainly as a system of making sure that people treat each other in love. The laws given to Moses and developed throughout our common history enforce the idea that we're to love one another. And when Jesus is confronted and asked to describe what the most important laws are, he says the most important laws are to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. So justice is about loving your neighbor as yourself. His inquisitor was asked Jesus, well, then, okay, fine, but who is my neighbor? And Jesus told the story that many people know as the parable of the Good Samaritan. But the bottom line of that story is that your neighbor is the person you are most predisposed to dislike. That's who you have to treat exactly the same as you would expect to be treated yourself. And so justice is all about that treatment. The other comment I would make, and then I'll stop, is that as I understand justice as spoken about directly in our scripture, it's really almost always discussed in the context of restraints on the most powerful. Sometimes it really sounds like it's about accountability and specific rules and the enforcement of specific rules, but it always comes down to persons in power treating persons with less power, orphans, widows, outsiders, as they would be treated if they didn't have that lesser status. So it's about a leveling of status and treating all people equally because we are all made in the image of God.
Thank you. Hurunnessa, would you like to take a stab at that question?
Sure. Thank you, Faith. It's really actually quite simple in Islam. You know, there's so many verses of justice in our holy book. One of them is where God says, we have already sent down our messengers with clear signs and sent down with them the book and the balance, that people may stand for justice. So this concept of sending out messengers and prophets for the sole purpose of making sure that justice is implemented on this earth is, you know, it speaks in volume. It's a concept that is, you know, prevalent throughout the Quran. It is something that we as Muslims are supposed to be adherent to, even if it's against ourselves. You know, there's another verse where God says you have to make sure that you are implementing justice, even if it's against yourself. So imagine us as human beings, and sometimes we're quite selfish, standing and thinking, wait, am I being just to this person, even though I might be the perpetrator? Am I actually looking at where I'm coming from in the situation? So God is always telling us throughout the Quran that our purpose is to be just, and that justice is for all, and especially those who are under us, whether it's at work or in society, or those who are weaker or who are poor. We need to make sure that the justice that is supposed to be implemented within our system, the structure of our system, is implemented for everyone, and especially for those who are voiceless. And this idea of worshiping God, implementing justice is worship of God. Right? We think that it's just something that we have to do because it's morally right and ethically right. But at the same time, because it's a commandment of God, it is also something that we get rewarded for, right? So God is implementing his justice on us, his love and his light of making sure that we understand our purpose in this world, regardless of background, regardless of where you're from, your skin color. Justice is something that's supposed to be implemented throughout the playing field of everyone that you're involved with. And that is something that we're encouraged to take with us on a daily basis and throughout our day, whether we're at work or at home with our children, or dealing with people on the street or people at the mall. We have to make sure that we're not violating anyone's rights, and that we are advocates of justice throughout the day.
Thank you. Michael, we'll just call on you now.
But you know, the two panelists that went before me, you know, really said some extraordinary things that bear a lot of resonance and a lot of echoes within Jewish tradition as well. You know, we we believe also, in that foundational text from the book of Genesis, that all human beings are created in God's image. And rabbinic tradition, on which much of Judaism is founded, looks at that text and has this extraordinary teaching about it. It says, why is it that God created the world with one human being to begin with, right? That one human being or two human beings created in the divine image. And the answer they give is twofold. The first is actually threefold. The first is that it means that to save a life is to save an entire world, and to destroy a life is to destroy an entire world. So we have the infinite value and dignity of each human life. So that is a core component of justice. That there is no human being that is insignificant. There's no human life that's insignificant, and that all are equal in their infinite value. The second principle is that so that no human being can say my parent is greater than your parent, right? We all come from, as it were, the same parent. And so therefore we are, all of us in Jewish tradition, considered to be brothers and sisters, regardless of what ethnicity, background, skin color, religious tradition you come from. We are all equal in our lineage, in our parentage. And so therefore we are to construct societies, broadly speaking, that reinforce that fundamental equality. But then it also adds something really extraordinary. It says, the fact that God creates the world with one human being to begin with speaks to God's greatness. Why? Because when a flesh and blood sovereign mints a coin, the sovereign will make a mold, and then every coin will come out looking the exact same as that mold. But God created one human being, and subsequently, no two human beings are exactly alike. And so God's greatness is testified to by the presence of human diversity, right? And that diversity is inseparable, right? That is a measure of God's greatness and a measure of our greatness. So that also means that justice requires the preservation and the elevation of diversity, but the celebration of human diversity, right? Justice therefore means that we cannot flatten other people's experiences, other people's cultures, other people's language, other people's faiths to fit into the model of the dominant culture, the dominant language, the dominant faith. That I think goes to that same notion that the bishop mentioned, right? That a good portion of justice in Jewish tradition is about the protection of the minority from the majority, the protection of the vulnerable from the powerful. And so therefore, I think that justice ultimately in Judaism has kind of two functions. Or two aspects. One is administrative justice, right? In other words, that laws should be created in fairness with an eye toward equality and fairness, and should be administered in fairness, right? To the book of Deuteronomy says, you shall not show deference to the rich or to the poor. You should not. You should administer justice justly. And the second dimension of it is distributive justice, right? That we should not have there might inevitably be some amount of inequality, economic inequality, resource inequality in our world that might inevitably happen as the course of human nature unfolds. But there, according to Jewish tradition, can't be a permanent underclass. There can't be a group of people that perpetually has less and a group of people that perpetually has more. That there have to be fail-safes in place within society to ensure that the needs of everybody are met, that everybody is able to live in dignity and in plenty, and that nobody, according to the book of Deuteronomy, there shall be no needy among you, right? So systemic inequality, the presence of inequality of all sorts, whether it's racial inequality, economic inequality. Often in our society, those go hand in hand. That is an intolerable situation from the Jewish tradition. And then the Jewish tradition adds one more piece to it, which says that you are duty bound to protest, to object to inequality, to injustice when you see it. You cannot stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. You cannot look away when you see oppression.
Thank you, Michael. So far, what I've heard from the three of you reminds me of a theological statement from one of our early church fathers, Uranus, who said that to hate another human being is patricide. That to hate another, just to merely hate another human being is to kill your own, is like killing your own family. And so now we come to Corey. Ask you now also to respond to this question. How does your faith tradition define justice, and how do you define justice?
Well, I'm like the bishop. I come from the Christian tradition, Protestant Christianity, as an American Baptist, ordained American Baptist minister. But what I like to do is sort of reflect on this question quite differently. Often in the Abrahamic traditions, we think that there are these pristine texts that give us this understanding of what justice is, or what these ideals are, as if these ideals are unscathed and untouched from human hands in the history and the materiality of the world and of society and of existence. So when we begin to think of justice within these faith traditions, we often begin to think of them as these ideal types that are unscathed and unsullied, but in many ways, they are interpreted by communities of the faithful across space and time, such that justice in the U.S. Across over 2.5, across centuries, has meant that justice means that white people are in charge and legitimately in charge, and that whites have a faith-based reason to then support the inhumanity of blacks. So what justice means is that justice is used in an unequal power dynamic, and religious scriptures, religious texts are used to support that. And we see that globally, and we see that throughout the Abrahamic traditions. So what we have to do is then recontextualize the question. What is it that we mean by justice in this moment? How do our communities of the faithful understand, interpret, and then provide interpretive structures as well as material structures to then enhance that interpretation, such that to go back to the text means we go back to the text with a particular lens. We go back to these texts with a particular interpretive understanding. We go back to these texts with a particular understanding that we must then look at the text and look for those marginalized others whose voices are not heard in the dominant interpretive traditions of the text. We go back to the text to begin to understand how justice is understood from those on the underside of the text. That in one text we may say the marginalized, but in another text, the justice is meted out by God being on our side. And the side that God is on in these textual traditions are the side of the powerful, the side which God then deems out and mets out God's mission in and through human activity. So I want us to sort of foreground the very humanity, the infinite humanity, the infinite particularity of justice, so that it doesn't become a static ideal, but justice becomes a way of life, a way of living, a way of interrogating our structures, our ways of thinking, and our ways of living in the world. Justice becomes the ways in which we understand the infinite particularity of humanity across space and time. That justice is something that is not fiat accompli at one moment, but justice is something that is a constant struggle for all of us to realize across space and time, and how our traditions get it right and how our traditions get it wrong. And then how we must continue to revise and enhance our traditions so that we then begin to realize and create the openness that justice requires for it to constantly be made and remade in the course of human history, human existence.
So if that is the reality that we have to figure out and that we need to be self-reflective and interrogate our own text and our own lives and the way that we have the lens that we've used to interpret our faith and to practice our faith, what sort then of justice is needed? What sort of justice is needed in order for us to interrogate our text and actually interrogate our text in light of our times? So in other words, let's dig into what you have raised, Corey. Let's interrogate. How do our texts help us interrogate these times?
I'll jump in here. I think that the texts that we've raised up, we've lifted up, provide us with a beginning lens. And these texts are always married to the very experiences of history and the experiences of people across space and time, and the new meanings that they imbue these texts with. Imagine an enslaved African American reading the story of the Exodus and then imbuing that story of the Exodus with a new meaning in the American context, such that Pharaoh becomes the US government. But it is not just one time and one moment, that this becomes a way in which we begin to interrogate those oppressive regimes locally and globally across space and time. That it's not just, I can't just hang my hat on a particular text and then assume that the text speaks, but in many ways, we are attempting to speak in and through the text. The text provides us with an understanding, a lens, a context, if you will, to begin to develop these aspirations. Just as the bishop was talking about the teachings of Jesus. The teachings of Jesus as a revolutionary took a long time to emerge, and it emerged within the context of communities. The ways in which different communities draw on the Abrahamic traditions, draw on the examples of the Prophet Muhammad, draw on the examples of the Hebrew peoples, draw on examples of Christianity and of early Christianity. Those traditions, those ways of thinking, those ways of being in the world, then inform how we go to these texts, how we read them, and then how we understand them in the light of our contemporary times. I'm reminded of in seminary, I remember this idea or the story of Karl Barth. Karl Barth would read the Bible, would read with the Bible in one hand and the daily newspaper in the other. That's what we have to understand about these conversations about justice. It is not that justice is something unscathed and unsullied, that we can go back to some pristine origin. But those origin stories then have to be interpreted in light of the times so that we don't then impose another injustice. And that could be the injustice of the text or the tyranny of our religious traditions that can then be the cause and source of new modalities of injustice in the world.
Bishop Jennifer, would you like to also respond to this question about how then do we do and be just in light of some of the weaknesses and maybe even some of the ways that we as humans have used our text or made our text static and not recognize their dynamic nature and what they ought to give us, what they ought to provide for us in terms of as an interpretive tool for our lives?
Yes, I think it's a really good question, and I appreciate this lens through which to look. I'm not sure static is a word that I would choose, but I would certainly agree that through history, Christians, and I'm sure others, have had a tendency to pick and choose and to interpret in ways that were not, excuse me, not really consistent with the intention of the text. It's a complicated text. We start with that. But the question that you're asking is, what do we do now? And how do we take the experience that we have now and use these teachings to do something that is restorative and that is fulfilling of the justice that we seek now? And I think that what Corey's talking about is truth, telling the truth. Another thing that Jesus said that is often quoted is that you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. And we're really grappling right now with truth. We're in a deconstructive, relativistic age, and everybody has a different perspective. It's very important that all those perspectives come to the table. As the rabbi said, that it's the diversity of humanity that is the glory of God. And if we're only hearing the perspective of one segment of the population, you're definitely going to get a distorted reading of the text. I think Corey is absolutely right about that. And the conversation has been dominated for centuries, at least in my tradition, by a particular perspective that has twisted words and done harm. There is no question. And so having the courage, the humility, the patience to read our own history, the last few hundred years in particular of our own history, to see where we have misapplied these principles and hurt other people, and to have the courage to set out on a new path, to take responsibility for what's happened, not for individuals to take responsibility for something that happened in the past, but to collectively, as a segment of society, take responsibility, and to, more than anything else, listen very deeply to the experiences of others, because when those have been cut out, we've gone down the wrong road, to put it mildly. So I think that justice at this point starts with opening the conversation across all kinds of divides and barriers, so that we really get to hear that marvelous diversity that we've been talking about.
Michael, would you like to also respond?
Sure. I'm really appreciative of the issues Corey raised, and Jewish tradition has a rich interpretive tradition. So that from very early on, we have learned or practiced not to take the Bible at face value, and to see everything within it as subject to interpretive lenses that are inevitably going to be informed by the circumstances in which you live and the vantage point of the observer. And so this conversation really got me thinking about the aside from the Bible, the central text of Jewish tradition is a text called the Talmud, and the Talmud was compiled about the year 500 of the Common Era, and is a compendium of conversations about the meaning of Scripture and about the meaning of the next layer on Scripture, which is a text called the Mishnah, which is itself a conversation about the meaning of Scripture. And so the Talmud is incredible because it raises lots of debates, but settles very few of them. So there's something like 5,000 debates or 5,000 conversations in the course of this multi-volume text, and only about 50 of them are actually resolved. Someone went in and actually counted it, and so that notion within Jewish tradition is that first of all, that there's a tyranny of resolution, right? If a matter is firmly resolved and it can't evolve or advance anymore, that there's no more conversation about it, that I think, to Corey's point, that can result in profound injustices. So the texts have to be dynamic because they have to speak to given times and places. They can't remain stuck in one place because all of their interpretations and applications are dependent on the circumstances in which you live. So they have to be dynamic. But there's one text in particular in the Talmud that I wanted to point out because it's great for this conversation. There are two rabbis in the Talmud who had two schools that are kind of the most prominent in the Talmud. One is a rabbi named Hillel, and the other is a rabbi named Shammai. And they had schools aptly named the School of Hillel and the School of Shammai. And one tractate of the Talmud records that these schools were discussing a point of law, a commandment from the Torah, the meaning of a commandment of Torah for many years, just debating back and forth. They couldn't resolve it. They couldn't figure out who was right. And so ultimately a divine voice comes out. They hear God's voice, and the voice says, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim hayim, that both of these are the words of the living God, right? Hillel is right, School of Hillel is right, and School of Shammai is right. And so, the question is then asked, okay, so then what do we do, right? If both of them are right. And the divine voice says, but the law is in accordance with the School of Hillel. So then the Talmud asks the inevitable question, which is, well, wait, if both of them are right, then why does the law follow the School of Hillel? And the answer is because they were kindly and modest, because they taught their own opinions only after giving precedence to the opinions of the other school. In other words, Jewish tradition is a pluralistic tradition. It embraces that diversity that we were talking about before, but it also recognizes the importance of normativity. You have to know that's part of justice. You have to know within a society, what to expect of one another, and what the rules are that we ought to follow. Now, it requires interrogating those rules and making sure consistently, perpetually, that we're following them, understanding them in a just way. But nevertheless, it says that we need to have agreed upon norms to follow. But the norms are not the highest bar, right? Like just having a law for the sake of having law and order, quote unquote, for the sake of having law and order, to go back to that King text that you raised before, is not justice. Right, justice is an interrogation of the norms that are through the prism of to the bishop's words, right, through the prism of love, through the prism of human dignity, through the prism of kindness and empathy, right? So that is the lens that our tradition, that Jewish tradition, always has us say, okay, we could interpret this text in any number of ways. We can lift up this text versus this text, and when texts conflict. So how do we determine how we're going to interpret those texts, and which we're going to elevate and which we're going to denigrate in any given moment? And the answer of that passage from the Talmud is that we do it through the prism of kindness, dignity, love, and empathy. And that is the framework by which we look at our sacred texts, and we say, I'm going to use this interpretation rather than that interpretation. I'm going to elevate this text that might conflict with this text, because this text, in practicality, even if not in intent, doesn't result in justice, right? But this text does, so I'm going to lift this one up. So I think that is a piece of the conversation, right? Like Corey said, what is the lens through which we view our text, and what are the values that we bring in the process of interpreting and teaching those texts?
So thank you, Michael. I want to, we're getting really very wonky and textual, and so I want to ask a question that maybe will help us bring this conversation into contemporary current times and what's going on every day and every evening in our streets, in our cities around the nation. And so I want to ask Hurunnessa, if you would respond first. What can or have we learned, or should we have learned about our faith traditions from the mostly young people protesting in our cities and around our country? They're mostly young, they're of every race, they're of every gender orientation, sexual orientation, national origin, and religion. And so it seems that there is something we need to learn, or have learned, or could use a lens for interpreting what we see, what we're seeing in our cities. each evening?
I think one of the biggest thing that we've learned about the youth in this country is how resilient, smart, and active they are in what they believe. And they're going to go out and make sure that everyone hears their point of view and making sure that justice is served from their own lens. And they're kind of paving way for the rest of us in using social media and advocating for those who are voiceless or whose voices we don't hear, right? The youth of America are really active in making sure that their words are pronounced in such a way that their ideas and their, even their moral stance and things they believe in are in the faces of those who are walking against them. So I have 4 girls, and my 2 eldest ones are adults, and my eldest wants to go and protest. So do the other ones. We have to make sure that things are safe for them because one has health issues, but at the same time they're very involved in these issues. They're very aware of what's going on in the world. I don't think I myself, growing up even in Queens, New York City, was as aware of what was going on in the country at their age as they are right now. They know exactly, if someone's being violated, where it happened, who it was, what the cop's name was, or who the perpetrator was, or who was being who was the victim, who was in need of help. They're very aware of these things because they have this connection to their innocence as a core, and that they know that what's wrong is wrong, and they don't have the fear of what society is going to say to them. They don't have the fear of being ridiculed. They don't have the fear of people standing against them saying that, well, I don't agree with you. They actually want to be in the faces of those people who are having or who are actually perpetrating these types of injustices in this country. And that teaches us a lot. I think we have a lot to learn from our youth. They're amazing. I'm seeing them on social media. I'm seeing them on the news, and they're talking about things that you wouldn't even think they know about, but they know. And their system of getting information across to one another speaks volumes. I mean, I don't think that they have really taken into account the viability and the the greatness of social media and technology right now to their advantage. I know Dr. Corey was talking about text and what that actually means in terms of moving people along a certain way. And as Muslims, we've seen organizations and extremists mistake our text and misinterpret those, and then we as people have to fight that, right? We have to change that narrative. They've hijacked our faith. We have to sit here and have conversations with people about who we are, and this has happened to all faith groups throughout history. But the stories in our text, the stories in the Bible, in the Torah, in the Quran, are stories that are examples for us to use. And actually, we're hearing the youth actually use these stories. They're writing it on boards, talking about justice and verses of the Quran and sayings of the Prophet on the boards, and sayings from the Bible and the Torah. They're all written, and these are young people. They're actually people of faith who are going out and using examples that have worked throughout history, and making sure people are getting the message across. And when you use faith context and you use faith text in this way, it resounds and it connects to so many people around when they see it. Right? They can connect to it. They can say, well, yeah, I'm of that faith, or what they have put on that card actually makes sense to me, and I want to be part of that. Let me go and research a little bit more about what they're saying. And they're going to see that as faith group that we are here. I mean, right now we only have 3 faith groups, but this is something that brings people together. And that's something that I see the youth have utilized, and they're working together even amongst different faith groups together, using social media, using technology, and using their faith as ways to bring people together, and making sure that the issues that are on the screen are being talked about and not forgotten.
Thank you. Bishop Jennifer and Michael and Corey, you're all responsible in some way for congregations, right? You have members that you, at some point, whether you're currently pastoring or not, you have been responsible for teaching and preaching and caring for and healing the sick. And so, what does this time and what do the young people teach us as faith leaders? What are they saying? What lesson is it that we ought to take from their willingness to put their bodies, their lives at risk on a number of levels? COVID-19, we're in the middle of a pandemic. They're not necessarily able to social distance, as well as putting their bodies in between police and maybe sometimes, now National Guard and others, between them and who they see as vulnerable, or who they're trying to protect, or who they're trying to speak for, give opportunity to speak. What can they teach us about our leadership, and what maybe we need to consider our arsenal of justice?
Faith, what we're seeing globally, what we're seeing in the U.S. is part of a global movement, and they're historic in nature. I mean, we just think of, we have this ideal of the Black freedom struggle as this struggle of older individuals, but the Black freedom struggle was really a movement of young people. Here in Virginia, when we think of Barbara Johns and the students at Moton High School, they're 16 years old in 1950 when they started their walkouts. When we think of the February 1st movement in Greensboro, North Carolina, where we get the sit-in movements, where they first started, they're starting from students, first-year students at North Carolina A&T, along with a long history of students working at Dudley High School. So we're seeing a continuation of a movement of young people in our contemporary moment, and they're catalyzing a broad base of new political movements that we see throughout the U.S. and throughout the world. Just if we think of from 1999, for the past 2 decades, we can look at the global anti-capital movements that really crystallized in and around Seattle. We can look at the Arab Spring when we look at students in Tunisia and also in Egypt and across North Africa. When we think of all of the ways in which we have the movements coming out of Ferguson, the movements of individuals coming together in our contemporary moment, we're seeing a new organic, rhizomatic type of politics that's really catalyzing broad swaths of people. And we have to remember that the young people today have a different formative experience. A number of their friends are different races, different sexual orientations. So the deaths of so many trans Black individuals strikes them quite differently than a different generation. The deaths of this intergenerational connection, these ties that we see. When we see the deaths of George Floyd, who's 46 years old, it really catalyzes young folks because they liken it to the deaths of Trayvon Martin. When we look at the deaths of so many African-American women at the hands of police, and from Sandra Bland to Breonna Taylor, and many more African-American women, we're seeing that this is not just a movement around the Black male, but this is really a movement around the ways in which Black bodies are always find themselves at the violent ends of state-sanctioned and culturally sanctioned anti-Black racism and violence. So we're seeing a new politics emerge. And the questions that we have to ask is, how do our faith traditions respond? How do our visions of justice understand the emergence of calls of justice that in some ways exceed those boundaries that we may think of traditionally? How do we begin to develop new interpretive lenses that then give voice to these interpretive communities and the ways in which they are parceling together and piecing together scriptures and sacred texts from a multiplicity of traditions, not just the Abrahamic traditions, but also other faith traditions and faith orientations beyond those dominant religious traditions. As a former dean of the Proctor School, the one thing that we were very interested in and very much committed to was developing those interpretive tools to understand where are the next, how do we begin to educate and inculcate understanding of individuals that's not static, but it actually lives. That these texts are living documents, that the ways in which we think they are static, that we can go back to an original meaning, actually belies the very ideals of the very ideal that these are living texts in the midst of community. And if we see community forming and reshaping in our moment, then we must understand that our faith traditions are in a moment of radical reshaping, radical reforming, that the norms that have guided us are being pressed in new directions such that new understandings of justice emerge, new understandings of the readings of these texts emerge. That goes to the point that you so presciently opened this conversation up with Martin Luther King Jr. King's letter to the letter from the Birmingham City Jail was written to the faith leaders of Birmingham. It wasn't written to the general audience. It was written to those individuals who felt that King had gone far, King in the Black freedom struggle had gone too far, and that they now exceeded the cause of justice traditionally understood through Christianity. But what King was saying was that those traditions are tethered to the very inaction of justice in the world, and they are tethered to the institutions that maintain the unjust structures, that these religious traditions legitimate that injustice. And now it is time for us to begin to change the ways in which we begin to engage those traditions. Now that's radical. And that's the way in which King, the way in which we understand King, who started with the Montgomery Improvement Association at 26, and remember at 39 he was dead. He was assassinated. Only a 13-year movement. That's a radical movement, but that youth is not only vital for the movement itself, it is also vital for the renewal of these religious traditions to begin to articulate new forms and new regimes of justice now and into the long future.
So Corey, what you just helped us to think about is the reality that, and to remember, again, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and churches, houses of worship, temples, and mosques are in a way being challenged by just the need to social distance, right? So we've not had continued gatherings in our houses of worship for several weeks now, going on several months. And so you've raised the concern that not only are we in a pandemic, that we're creating a time for us to rethink what it means to be our faith community, but it also is a time for what's happening in the streets because of George Floyd, because of Breonna Taylor, because of Ahmaud Arbery, that we are seeing a push and a call to be something new as traditions. And that's frightening, I'm sure, for many faith leaders. So Bishop Jennifer, what do you say to that? What do you say in this time where we are being called to something new, something different, has yet to emerge, but it is on, we see it on the horizon. We don't know what it is yet.
No question about that. And I would add to that, to what Dr. Corey just had to say, back to your question about young people. What I think that we have to learn right now from them is to build on what you said, Dr. Corey, the primacy of community over institutions. I see young people much more interested in actual person-to-person community and the people that they have come to know through their lives and their experiences, as you said. And that's much more important to them than the preservation of an institution. The other thing that I see that I think is really important, and you're talking about this to some extent, is the courage that they show. No greater love has anyone than to lay down their life for their friends, to go to some of the extreme just danger that some people are walking into right now. Or as Queen Esther put it, if I perish, I perish. I must confront this and I must stand for justice. And that is a very, very important example. As I was saying before, I think we've had some timidity about even confronting the truth of our own history. That's got to go away. We've got to look the truth in the face. We have got to hear the stories about what's going on. I think the great benefit of what is happening in this time, as you said, has to do with our access to the actual images that none of us can now erase from our minds of what is happening before our very eyes. That forces us to do what we should have been doing for a long time, because the information is there and it's undeniable. And so the ability to kind of walk out of those spaces, as you were saying, Faith, to leave our comfort. I don't like the term comfort zones because it's so overused, but just to leave the comfort of our spaces and the routines that we have had, and to be forced to look at the world and to see what's going on and to be led by some of the younger generations into a reckoning is a real gift. It's a real gift.
Michael, are we ready to, as our faith leaders of all stripes, right, from every tradition, are they ready to receive this gift?
You know, I think that the answer to that question is kind of a mixed bag, and I can't speak for, you know, every faith leader and every faith tradition. I think that you know, I think that, you know, in every dynamic you have, you know, you have probably, you know, 10% that are, you know, on the cutting edge and on the vanguard and really kind of understand these needs and these trends, and have their finger on the pulse of where you know, where our young people are leading us. And then there are probably 10% who are who are, you know, trying to anchor their traditions in the past, right, and trying to hold on to you know, to this kind of like nostalgic view of that old time religion. And then there are probably like 80% in the middle that are caught up in the flux, right? That aren't quite sure of the direction to go. And so what I would say to you know, I think I have something to say both to the 10% at the vanguard and the 80% in the middle. So what I want to say about the youth is one of the most beautiful things I think in Jewish tradition is that if there's a Torah scroll, right, the scroll that contains our sacred texts, it can't be used for ritual purposes if there are letters that are misformed or smudged or broken off in some way. And so the test to determine whether a Torah scroll is fit to be used is, can you bring a child to it who really just is at the beginning stages of knowing how to, you know, read words. Bring a child to the text and say, can you read this word? And if the child says no, then the text is not fit to be used. And if the text says, and if the child says yes, then you can use the text for ritual, the scroll for ritual purposes. So why is the child the metric? The child is the metric because they're going to be honest with you, right? And they don't care about, you know, how much the scroll costs and how much it's going to cost to repair, and, you know, who's in charge, whatever. They're gonna tell the truth. So I think that that's really, really important to understand, that like our kids are out in the streets because they see the truth for what it is, and they're not afraid to tell it to us. But what I would also say to the 10% of the vanguard that I think understands that about where our youth are leading us is that, you know, there's also a place, you know, the 10% that are at the that are, you know, holding the anchor also have something important to offer, which is, you know, what we as faith leaders can offer our youth is of course encouragement and support for the truth telling that they're doing, and the fighting that they're doing on all of our behalf. But I think we can also hold space for them to infuse them and inform them with the best of our tradition's values, to give them language that can help in that struggle, to give them a sense of rootedness, historical memory, memory, which, you know, from the Jewish tradition's point of view is crucial, right? To you know, to not be sort of like out there rudderless, without a recognition that the fight for justice now is tied to a millennial struggle for justice that dates back, that we see ourselves in that story of the Exodus that Corey alluded to before, right? And like in some level, like having that historical memory is important for the present moment. So I would argue that what faith leaders have we're repositories of those values and of that historical memory that we can offer as a gift to help guide our young people. And I'll, you know, just like add one other piece to that, which is, you know, I think that Bishop Jennifer's comments about the courage of our young people, you know, out there, you know, risking themselves in this moment is really, really inspiring. And at the same time, I think that, you know, our faith traditions can also make the issue a little bit more complicated for our young people, which is that, you know, they are, of course, putting themselves at risk by being out in the streets. But we know that that this virus is disproportionately impacting people of color and communities of color. And so one thing that I think that we can encourage people to be mindful of is, as they're going out, they're not only risking their own health and well-being, but they are also potentially jeopardizing the very communities that they're fighting on behalf of. So to complicate that a little bit and to say that that it's not always going to be a cut and dry question or answer about.
Oh, we've lost Michael, and so I really take his point to being concerned about the realities that we still are in a pandemic, and that we do have to encourage our young people to do all that they can to protect themselves at the same time, and that it does complicate being able to do the kind of work of protesting and justice work. Is close work, it's shoulder to shoulder work, it's hands-on work. And so I do want to kind of wrap us up with these two questions, and I don't know whoever wants to answer it, but I want to kind of, most of you are on this board, Virginia Interfaith Center's board, and so we think about nonprofits. Many of them are dedicated and established to resolving some of these social justice issues, the myriad social and political and economic issues that haunt and terrorize Black, brown, and poor white communities. And so, and putting that together with the question of what does a future just society look like? What is it that we're ultimately seeking to develop and to gain and to achieve and to win? And Jennifer, maybe you would, we only have a minute and 30 seconds, or maybe, oh, we lost Jennifer as well. So Hurunnessa, would you like to answer that?
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of times what we tend to miss out on is seeing the perpetual racism and inequity that is happening within organizations, whether they're on the board or on employees, and really self-reflecting of where we stand in those issues, in this issue, at least in racism, because it's one thing to say we're a social advocacy group or we're fighting for this and we're fighting for that. But when we, in our own homes, whether it's an organization or in our own personal homes, do not understand what that means, and we don't see that our talk and the things we're saying are perpetuating that cycle of racism, it's a problem. We need to understand that just because everyone on this panel is a person of faith and that we're using scripture and we're using words from our holy text to talk about justice doesn't mean that everyone who follows our faith is actually a proponent of justice and isn't a racist. We need to educate our homes. We need to educate our congregation. We need to educate those around us who don't understand the 401 years of racism that has been going on in this country and what that actually means for the Black community. If you're brown and you're a minority, your plight is not the same. You know, you can't say that I don't see racism and I'm not subjected to racism, so there isn't any. That's not the way it works. We need to make sure that we're educating people in exactly what has been going on in this country in factual ways, because there's a lot of misunderstanding and there's a lot of miseducation about the history of what has happened in this country. And if people can't understand that, they won't be able to fight for justice or for racial equity in this country as a whole.
And Bishop Jennifer, would you want to respond now that you have returned? We see you again.
Thank you. Just to end with saying that history is not fate. History is incredibly important to understand. It is a part of where we are now. We must tell the truth about it. And we believe that there can be a better future. The whole point of this is to move into a brighter future where there is no crying or pain or sorrow or injustice. And it will be a long and difficult battle, but that's where we're headed.
Corey, what advice would you give to nonprofits and social justice organizations that are right now trying to understand their mission and vision in light of the what's unfolding in our country?
Having them develop a mission and vision around how they construe justice in this moment and how the struggle for justice is manifesting itself in the everyday. It's not just, there's no single bullet, there's no single mode of action. Much like the late Howard Zinn reminded us, it is the small actions of millions of people that bring justice. So if we keep our vision pointed towards the bigger vision of justice and continue to enact it in our everyday lives, we will get there as a society. And I think what we have to also do is recognize that there's no inevitability in this. We've seen struggles that have come out and resulted in some programmatic and policy reforms. This is what your quote from King's letter from a Birmingham city jail reminds us of. We're reminded that in the pandemic of 1918, it was followed by the Red Summer of 1919. We're reminded that the Asian flu pandemic of 1957, in the midst of that pandemic, there was a continuation of the Black freedom struggle and the global decolonization struggle. In the Hong Kong flu of 1968, we still saw the assassination of King, Robert F. Kennedy, and the virulent Black backlash of a law and order presidency of a Nixon. And of course, with the AIDS pandemic, we witnessed the President Reagan for the first 3 years of his presidency not mention HIV/AIDS. And even after H1N1 in 2009, we saw a regime of austerity and neoliberal politics. So there are no guarantees as to the outcome just because we have a confluence of a pandemic, public health crisis, and a political crisis. It reminds us that we must continue the work of realizing justice in our world today.
We lost you for just a brief moment, but I would love to give you the opportunity to finish up and just to wrap up our conversation. And I want to remind us all that even though, and it echoes a lot of what Corey just said, that even though we are in a moment, right, a moment of change and where there are a number of ways that this moment can go. Where our hope is that we will all work towards bringing this moment, ushering in a just society and a just world. And so, Michael, I would love to give you the last word here.
Wow, I'm just so appreciative of everything that I've gotten to learn from my great co-panelists today. You know, I think I was in the middle saying, you know, that we as faith leaders have, an opportunity both to support, this young people's movement for systemic justice and racial justice in our society, and also to help give it shape and direction, and to root it in collective historical memory and the values of our tradition. So that's an opportunity and a challenge, I think, for us to help nurture and guide in that way. And what I would say, I guess, in closing, is just like a couple of teachings from Judaism come into my mind as we meet this moment. So, one, that the day is short, the task is great, and the workers sometimes get weary, but the sovereign is insistent. There's a whole text there to decolonize, in the spirit of what Corey offered, but nevertheless, what it says is that we have a lot of work to do, and we can't let ourselves get tired and fall back, right? We can't let ourselves get bored and distracted by all of the things that serve to distract us from this moment. This is we're in the midst of a very intense and impassioned moment, but we can't lose that passion. But simultaneously, to say that it's not upon any of us individually to finish the work, but neither are we free to desist from it. So, in other words, right, we may not in our lifetimes get to that vision of perfect racial justice that all of our traditions share. Perfect justice that all our traditions share, but nevertheless, we are obligated to continue being involved and invested in the work, as Corey said. So to not let ourselves get sidetracked, to not let ourselves get distracted, to not let ourselves grow weary, and to always remember that we each and every day have a responsibility to continue in the work, and let us never think that any of our actions or inactions are insignificant. Every single thing we say and do, everything that we say that we don't say and don't do, all of it matters.
Well, I want to thank each of my panelists today. You all have brought to this conversation just rich understanding and wisdom and thoughtfulness that I know that those who are listening are being ushered into a new place and a new way of thinking about justice, thinking about this moment and what's going on for themselves, but also what's happening in our country and globally. And so I'm just so very grateful that all of you agreed to be part of this conversation today. Obviously, it cannot be, we are not putting a period. We are recognizing that this conversation must continue. And it must be more than conversation. We must take it into the realm of action. Again, thank you so much.